A lot of research on political marketing in Canada has focused almost exclusively on the federal level, and in particular, parties on the right side of the political spectrum. The Conservative Party of Canada has been the major focus for a lot of political scientists and students of political marketing. To address this gap, today's talk will focus on the political marketing strategies and tactics employed by a party on the left in Canada, the New Democrats, and not just at the federal level, but also in two provincial contexts in Nova Scotia and Manitoba. Through this research, which was been conducted alongside Mike Moyes from the University of Manitoba, we found that these left-wing parties, the New Democrats, have drawn heavily on the campaign strategies and playbooks introduced decades earlier by the Labour Party in Britain under Tony Blair. Specifically, these New Democratic parties have drawn on Blair's approach to campaigning that involved a three-pronged strategy of inoculation, moderation, and simplification of their campaign messages. So what follows is actually the product of a couple of different research studies, one with Mike Moyes, and it appears in a new book called Political Communication in Canada, available through UBC Press. I'd encourage folks to pick that book up because it has a lot of great information, not just about left-leaning parties, but political marketing in general. And I also draw on an earlier paper that I wrote for the Canadian Political Science Association conference back in 2006, which explored the intersection between the third way in Canada and other forms of political ideologies, in particular red Toryism. So today I'd like to walk you through the way that the third way has materialized in Canada, at least from the 1988 to 2011 period, which is the focus of this research. Then discuss a bit about Blair's approach to political marketing, again, that three-pronged strategy of inoculation, moderation, and simplification. And then delve into the three case studies that we explored in our research. Those of Gary Dewar, now Ambassador to the United States, but then New Democratic Party leader in Manitoba, Darrell Dexter, Nova Scotia's first New Democratic Premier, and the late Jack Layton, who led his party, the federal New Democrats, to the official opposition status for the first time in Canadian history. We'll close with a few lessons that we've drawn from our research that may help to inform our approach to studying or observing the third way in Canada today. It's worthy of note that we focused on these three case studies. There are others that could be explored, including Saskatchewan, BC, and Ontario, all of which have featured relatively strong New Democratic parties, some of whom have formed government in recent years as well. But we can find our case studies to those three. So to begin with the third way, most folks who are tuning into this webcast are probably familiar with the third way as an ideology. I mean, as a brand of social democracy, the third way kind of coalesced into a coherent ideology in the late 20th century. Granted, a lot of its core principles had surfaced decades earlier. In Canada, Ed Broadbent's New Democrats in the 1980s demonstrated some affiliation with third way principles. And the term third way has been applied in other often right-wing contexts. Like you can recall some campaigns in the early 2000s, Ralph Klein, a conservative in Alberta, referring to his platform as the third way. But by shifting away from their traditional focus on full employment and government largesse as their ultimate goals, and comprehensive state planning as a means to that end, the emergence of the third way movement in Canada, at least, marked a turning point in the history of social democracy. Ultimately, the third way amounts to an opposition toward the new right and a dissatisfaction with the old left. As its two more famous proponents, Tony Blair and Gerhard Schroeder, once put it, the third way was all about meeting old goals like social justice through new means, including what they called economic dynamism. This involved supporting things like the market economy without promoting the emergence of a market society. That resulting outlook is an attempt to unite the two main forces of the left, liberalism and socialism, under a shared ideological outlook, if not a shared partisan banner. So, at least in Canada, the third way has emerged under four major pillars. The first is equality and social justice. Here, a belief in human equality and the pursuit of social justice lie at the heart of all brands of social democracy, not just the third way. But what distinguishes the third way from other variants of social democracy is its precise conception of equality, which combines some elements of liberalism with those of socialism. As Hombach, a political scientist, has once put it, third way social democrats have abandoned the pursuit of equality as an end result, attempting instead to create the widest possible equality of opportunity throughout society. And as a result, third way social democrats are often accused of being liberals in disguise. The second main pillar of third way social democracy is community and mutual obligation. As Ed Broadbent, former federal NDP leader here in Canada, explains, whereas a liberal sees an individual's life as unfolding in a society that stands in an antagonistic relationship to the state, and in which citizens are essentially in competition with one another, social democratic individualism incorporates cooperation. Just as human beings have individual and common goals, they also share certain responsibilities and rights. That's where the old left viewed social equality as relatively unconditional. The third way social democrat attaches duties to those same claims. Third, a harnessed market. The third way's acceptance of the market economy is also an important to note, an important departure from previous forms of social democracy. What's new is their emphasis on the market as a positive force in fostering social justice. Market's not just a necessary evil, which it was under previous modes of social democracy, but rather a necessary good to be harnessed for the benefit of the entire community. In a phrase that was used by French Prime Minister Lionel Jospin, the third way says yes to the market economy, but no to the market society. And lastly, the third way involves a certain element of democratic renewal. Third way social democracy holds that regardless of its political stripe, whether that's left or right, a homogeneous political elite is really ill-equipped to act on behalf of the entire community. The exclusion of many groups in society from positions of political power, including women, ethnic minorities, and the poor, is not only a form of discrimination according to the tenets of the third way, it actually hampers the ability of people, a society, to improve the community they govern collectively. So those are the four main pillars of the third way, and in previous research I've actually examined the third way and compared it with other centrist forms of political ideologies in Canada, including red Toryism. And we find a lot of overlap here, a lot of room for common ground between what appear to be folks on different ends of the political spectrum. Red Tories in Canada believe, like third way social democrats do, in collectivism, that society is more than a sum of its parts. The term social fabric is actually a Tory term, but it does also mesh well or align well with the third way social democrats' approach to mutual obligation. Both red Tories and third way New Democrats or social democrats in Canada also believe in the interconnectivity of society and the market, or the market economy and society. They believe in the importance of a strong state. Thirdly, in the case of red Tories, they believe the state should be employed to achieve the public good as opposed to individual gains. But that matches well with the third way social democrats' approach to social justice. And lastly, the two ideological families believe in incrementalism as opposed to radical change. And again, for the third way social democrats, that's a departure from the more radical or revolutionary aspects of traditional social democracy or socialism. For red Tories, it was a matter of being more conservative or preservative, not trying any new policy ideas until they were well tested. So there is a certain, the third way found a conducive environment in Canada due to the fact that red Toryism had been alive and well in Canadian politics for a number of decades. And as a result, we found several, in provinces like Manitoba in particular, several folks who would find themselves able to vote conservative in some elections and New Democrats in others because because of those shared ideological principles. When it comes to the campaign approach of Social Democrats here in Canada, again, they borrowed heavily on the Blair model, which, for those that are unfamiliar, the New Labour story really began in 1983, which was the Labour Party's rock bottom moment. The party's image as an old line socialist party had been really seared into the public memory, thanks in no small part to the Thatcher Conservatives' effective campaigns to that effect. As one Labour strategist put it at the time, or years later, pardon me, of the time, years later, almost every voter in Britain had an image so negative, so destructive, so alienated, that it had taken 14 years, 3 party leaders, and a totally remade party to eradicate it. Labour in the early 1980s was viewed, in his words, as the party of extremism, of union domination, of strikes, of roaring inflation and punitive taxation, of soft defense, of massive public ownership, of incompetence, of indiscipline, of disunity. He goes on, this negative Labour identity stuck, burrowing deep into the psyche of the British electorate and casting a shadow of fear that was never truly removed until Labour had won and Tony Blair was in Downing Street. So the question is really, how did Blair resurrect the party and change this overwhelmingly negative public image? Well, as Moyes and myself have suggested in our research, they employed a 3-pronged strategy. In first, inoculating the party against its traditional weaknesses. This involved, first and foremost, changing the name of the party from Labour to New Labour. And it may seem like this is a matter of semantics, but it actually did help to reinvent the party brand-wise, which was a major component of New Democrats here in Canada, their resurrection of their party. It also involved, in Blair's case, shifting the party's rhetoric and its policy suite. And the most famous of these moves came with the removal of Clause 4 from the party's constitution, which contained a firm commitment to traditional socialist principles. At the same time, though, they also shifted towards a new neoliberal acceptance of the market and taxation policies, which is really related to the second prong of the Blair strategy, moderating the party's platform. A lot has been written about Blair's commitment to the third way in this respect, and I don't mean to rehash it here, but suffice it to say that the move was intended to reach out to what they called Middle Britain, a group far less skeptical of neoliberalism than Labour's traditional base. Thirdly, New Labour took a novel approach to campaign communications. Rather than releasing a comprehensive program, the party focused on a limited number of concrete policy pledges. These served as sort of a contract with voters, allowing them to assess the desirability or the attractiveness of a Labour mandate while holding the government to account after the election. And this isn't a particularly new strategy. Pledge cards, as they were actually quite popular throughout most of British politics and also in Canada in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. So it's actually a return to a simpler time, if you will, when it comes to campaign communications. These 3 components were related, of course. Moderation helped the party to inoculate itself against charges that it was the same old Labour, tax and spend, and so on. Simplifying the party's communications also helped to convey a fresh new approach while changing the perception that the party was interested in comprehensive social engineering. It's tough to do that when you only have 5 campaign platforms. Easier to be labeled as a party of social engineering if you release, as Gary Dewar put it, a telephone book of policy pledges. Together, these 3 tactics made up a successful strategy and, as we argue, a real model for left-leaning parties in the rest of the world, including Canada's New Democrats. And the first Canadian New Democrat party to take them up on this model were the Dewar New Democrats, the Dewar NDP in Manitoba. Like Blair's party, the Manitoba New Democrats had a rock-bottom moment of their own, the 1988 election, when they fell from government all the way down to third-party status. And like New Labour, it would take over a decade in opposition for the Manitoba New Democrats to rebrand and recover. Fortunate for them, they had a model on which they could rely, the Blair model, and they drew upon it explicitly according to those that we interviewed as part of our study. I should say at this point, the following case studies rely on in-depth interviews with 16 New Democratic advisors who involved in these respective campaigns, and some of them actually involved the leaders themselves. So Duerr's approach first involved Blair's first prong, inoculation. If Blair renamed his party New Labour, the same term couldn't quite be replicated in Canada. You couldn't call yourself the New Democrats. You could maybe call yourselves the New NDP, but they settled instead on the phrase, the moniker, today's NDP. And that helped to distinguish them from yesterday's NDP and also divided them from today's Conservatives. In particular, in terms of inoculation, and this also bleeds into their approach to moderation, they shifted on three major policy areas, those that had become associated with their old image. First, agreed to abide by the Conservative government's balanced budget legislation. And this helped to inoculate them against claims that they were a tax and spend party that was going to continue spending Manitoba further and further into debt. They also agreed not to renationalize the Manitoba telecommunications system, MTS, which had been a Crown corporation, a very popular one in Manitoba, that had been privatized, and there was rumors that the New Democrats would want to renationalize it, and that was seen as being part of their old image as a traditional socialist party. They said absolutely not, went on record and said we will not be renationalizing MTS, and that was a surprise to many, and signaled again that this was a new party. Thirdly, they pledged to reform Manitoba's campaign finance system, and in particular outlaw donations from corporations and from unions. And many folks saw this as an attempt to distance the party from its traditional union base. Subsequent research with David Stewart and myself has shown that actually the New Democrats were far less dependent on union donations at the time than the Conservatives. Their main opponents were dependent on corporate donations. So this actually had the added benefit of providing them with a financial advantage in the long run. So that inoculation, it also related to the party's policy moves towards a more moderate centrist approach. As Gary Duerr himself put it, this meant moving beyond left and right to finding a way forward and focusing on what he called doable solutions, feasible solutions to the problems facing Manitoba. And the third prong, simplification, involved boiling down again what Gary Duerr referred to as the telephone book of policy promises that the party had used to release during election campaigns, boiling it down to, in 1999, 5 good reasons to vote for the New Democrats. In 2003, the next election, they called it 5 priorities. And in his last election in 2007, he expanded it to include six major priorities. Again, these priorities focused on the party's strengths, the issues that they owned, including healthcare, but they also focused on the party's threats, including balanced budgets. So you can see again the relationship between inoculation and simplification in this sense. And if we take a look statistically at the New Democrats in Manitoba, the number of pages in their policy platforms and the number of commitments, you can see a stark difference between 1995 and 1999. And by the way, Gary Duerr was leader of the party throughout this period. 1990, they went from 105 pledges to 1995 down to 81. But the real dramatic change came in 1999, which also coincided with the party's resumption of power in Manitoba. So they were in opposition in 1990 and 1995, changed their approach dramatically, and that coincided with their return to government. And that same approach lasted throughout the Duerr government's time in office. Further east in Canada, in Nova Scotia, the New Democrats did not have a real rock bottom moment like you'd find Tony Blair and Gary Duerr's parties had experienced. Rather, they experienced a real disappointment in 1998 and 1999 at not being able to take the next big step into government. The party had kind of stalled in terms of its popular support, pulling up to a solid three-way race for government between the New Democrats, the PCs, the Conservatives, and the Liberals. But they weren't quite able to push over that hump to achieve government. And as a result, Dexter, who became party leader in 2001, decided that a shift in strategy was necessary, and he turned westward to Manitoba and brought in advisors from the Dewar government to provide him with some advice on how to do so. In Nova Scotia, it was interesting because unlike the Manitoba New Democrats who had been in power previously and the Blair government who had been in power previously, Nova Scotia had never had an NDP government. So Dexter wasn't saddled with the problems that come along with that. There was no baggage, there was no previous government record, for good or for bad. So as a result, they never had to prove themselves or never had the opportunity to disprove that they were a tax and spend party. But they were still labeled as that in Atlantic Canada. So like Dewar, they did things like adopting a balanced budget pledge and focused on the doability or feasibility of their policy pledges. In terms of moderation, they did also focus on the doability notion, and it fit well with Dexter's pragmatic approach to government. Like Dewar and his team, Dexter really eschewed the whole notion of old left-right divisions. According to one of Dexter's advisors, and this is a rather lengthy quote, he said, "It's not a case of being sure that you still say and do the things you said and did 20 or 30 or 50 years ago. It's ensuring that the values and approach, which I would say are unique to the NDP and unique to the Social Democratic parties, carry on, but are relevant in the current context. This has been an important discussion on the left for the longest time. The relevant role or perceived truth or philosophy or ideology compared to applying that in current circumstances. Actually applying your party's values to the circumstances as you find them in any particular province or country or part of the world is what's important and what really brings life to being a social democratic party," end quote. Further to this, the strategist suggested, quote, "There are no sacred cows. Yes, you have your values, but not ones where you set yourself up with a whole host of sacred cows, untouchable places to go. You need to remain relevant," unquote. So if that's the way that the Dexter strategists had conceived of their party's move to the moderate center, it certainly did appear to resonate with the public. Another advisor of Dexter's said, quote, "Obviously, we as a party have our firm base in the ideology of social democracy, and that's something which informs our decision-making as a party and as a government. But at the same time, I think Darrell, as leader and as premier, was more interested in talking about solutions than in talking about any ways of thinking. It goes back to the whole notion of talking about solution and commitments rather than talking about platitudes," end quote. And lastly, the Dexter model involved boiling down the party's policy program into a smaller number of key commitments. But unlike Dewar and Blair, according to Dexter's advisors, this was less a strategic choice than it was actually an accident. According to one of their strategists, quote, "We announced that list of key commitments at an event," and you can see it here, the list of key commitments in 2013. They announced it at a campaign event. In his words, "As it turns out, just days before the campaign began, and unexpectedly to us, the news media described the release of those key commitments as the release of our platform. And in a sense, it looked like a platform, but it was costs, and they were explained. We had on the books the idea that we were going to follow it up with a more traditional platform book, but the team all looked at each other, looked at the coverage, and saw what resources we had for the impending campaign and said, let's not waste any time gilding the lily and spoiling the effect that we've had, saying that there's a clear, simple NDP platform already released ahead of the campaign." So as a result, they simply went ahead with that particular set of policy pledges as opposed to releasing their policy platform. And you can see here the Dexter model looks very similar to the Dewar model in terms of boiling down their campaign platforms into a smaller, more manageable chunks of commitments. And lastly, the Layton model really, the Leighton experience kind of straddles the line between Dewar and Dexter. Like Dexter, there was no real rock bottom moment for the New Democrats that they'd experienced in Manitoba or Labour had experienced in Britain. Rather, like Dexter, the New Democrats had kind of topped out in their level of support and were looking to take that next big step into government. In the end, they actually formed Canada's official opposition for the first time ever. And that, we argue, is due to a change in strategy. The Leighton team did explicitly draw on the experiences and expertise of the Dewar and Dexter campaigns, according to their strategists. According to one of those advisors, we were always very conscious of learning lessons from our successful provincial parties. Without questions, we had individuals from Manitoba and Nova Scotia parties in our election planning group, and they would bring to the table what worked for them. We had to translate that into the federal context because Canada is obviously much more than just the provinces and territories that make it up. So you can't copy and paste per se, but you can certainly learn from it, end quote. So the Jack Leighton approach involved inoculating the party against those traditional tax and spend labels by focusing, in their words, again, on doability, feasibility, and in what Jack Leighton himself called practical first steps. They also rebranded the party Jack Leighton's Party, while it did not appear on billboards in those exact words. Jack featured prominently on the campaign materials across the entire country, and it was a rebrand not unlike today's NDP and New Labour. It was just subtler and more connected to the individual party leader. In terms of moderation, we defer in our research to the wonderful research done by David McGrain from the University of Saskatchewan, and his social democracy project is definitely worth looking into. McGrain's research demonstrates that the New Democrats gradually shifted to the political center over time and adopted third way style policies, market copying techniques, and a well crafted market challenging strategy in Quebec. They were looking for a real niche in the marketplace, according to one NDP advisor. And for them, it wasn't on the traditional left-right spectrum. It wasn't on the federalist or sovereigntist spectrum in Quebec. Instead, the party tended to emphasize its leader, Jack Leighton, as the most trustworthy one on offer, and to try to, in their words, quote, get things done in Parliament. And so that was their approach to moderation, was to move away from the left-right distinctions and talk about doability, feasibility, and getting things done. And lastly, in terms of simplification, the federal NDP implemented a very similar campaign strategy that we found in Nova Scotia and in Manitoba. In fact, one advisor for the federal NDP noted that, quote, they were very focused, and referring to the Manitoba New Democrats, they were very focused in their messaging. They kept things fairly straightforward, and they didn't put out, for instance, 200-page platforms. They had very, very straightforward messaging that was about people and not about the party, which I think was very, very important. And they were very disciplined, unquote. The Leighton model, it's a little bit different at the federal level in that you have to promise more things, arguably because the country involves far more communities and constituencies than exist at the provincial level. That said, Jack Leighton, when he took over the party following the 2000 election, did demonstrate a real commitment to reducing the number of commitments that the party was making and keeping them in a more manageable number. In fact, in 2011, the federal NDP implemented a hybrid approach to their campaign platform. While they released a relatively comprehensive program, they used public messaging to focus on 5 key commitments that would be implemented within the first 100 days of forming government. And in 2011, those 5 priorities were: number 1, hiring more nurses and doctors; number 2, strengthening your pension; number 3, kickstarting job creation; number 4, helping out your family budget; and number 5, fix Ottawa for good, a reference to democratic reform, which again forms part of the third way approach to government. So what are some of the big lessons from these case studies here in Canada? Well, first, these parties were able to shift their campaign strategies, shift their policies, which was even more dramatic and challenging, because they were able to convince their members of the attraction of the next big step. In other words, the parties were able to say, in Manitoba's case, like New Labour, this is rock bottom. If we don't change things now, we're not going to be able to take the next big step, resurrect our party, and put us back on firmer footing. In the case of Dexter and Layton, it was a matter of convincing their party members that in order to form government, to get off of this plateau that we've reached in terms of popular support, we need to try something new. And they were able to convince party members and their base of moving towards the political center, of simplifying their platforms, and of running away from their old image as a tax and spend party. And that wasn't easy in all cases. It meant actually having hard conversations with people like traditional union supporters to say that we're going to have to limit your ability to donate to our campaigns, and we're going to have to limit your influence on our eventual platform. But it ended up being successful. Secondly, the success of these three parties also relied heavily on the collapse of the Liberal vote in Canada, the big L Liberal Party vote. It remains to be seen whether the Third Way will be able to sustain this kind of popularity in the face of the resurrection of the Liberal Party in provincial party systems across Canada, as well as at the federal level. The third point, each of these leaders was very effective in both big and small rooms. In other words, they were able to campaign effectively on the hustings to the entire electorate. But as mentioned earlier in our first point here, they were able to campaign for their party's new strategy and approach within small rooms, constituency meetings, and with key party supporters in order to convince them that that was the important way forward. And lastly, we've learned that there's a cross-pollination of ideas when it comes to campaigns and political marketing, but also policies and the like. This whole idea of the Third Way migrated from Europe to Canada through Ed Broadbent and the New Democrats federally, and then through Dewar, Dexter, and other leaders of that like, and eventually back into the federal party under Jack Layton. But it was important to note that these ideas didn't just come, the advisors came as well. The Dewar New Democrats famously visited with New Labour strategists one summer before the 1999 election to talk about strategies. And Dewar loaned his party strategist to go work with Dexter. And Layton drew on advisors from both teams when crafting their own party strategy as well. Not exclusively, of course, but they did. Last point I'll raise before wrapping up today's talk is to note that not everything that we've discussed in this talk today resonates with every single party advisor. In fact, several took issue with our analysis, saying that there was no explicit link with Tony Blair. Several party leaders also took issue with bits and pieces of our analysis, but overall we're confident that we have demonstrated that these ideas of the Third Way had been imported in Canada from 1988 to 2011. Again, where we go from here, where the Third Way goes from here, remains to be seen. The same challenges that New Labour faces in Britain are also being faced by Canadian parties as well, with the resurrection of neoliberalism and the rise of the Conservative Party. But in Canada, the special challenges that involve the rise of the Liberal Party, the other party of the center-left that seems to be clawing back some of the support that led to the Democrats on their way to power. So with that, if anyone has any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. Feel free to email me at jwesley@ualberta.ca.